Thank you for telling me that. As with any military base or encampment, there's got to be a certain amount of discipline. And there were 4,000 soldiers capable of being housed at the cantonment at any one time. It was a huge 300-acre facility. As you can see back there from the model, it was pretty gigantic. In fact, I think I read something that the parade ground was a mile long. So, discipline had to be maintained. And Marvin Veeder, who spoke a couple of weeks ago on May 20th, he told me a story about how there was a soldier who had his horse down on Route 20 in a tavern. And he got drunk. For some reason, he was an angry person, and he went out, and his horse was tied up. And he bayoneted the horse 50 times, which was a terrible thing to do. He was immediately court-martialed for animal abuse, maybe one of the first people ever tried for animal abuse. And he was given 100 lashes. And a few days later, because of the 100 lashes, he died. Now, one might almost say that he deserved that. He deserved a punishment like that. But there was another fellow, a fellow who has come down to us in history, right in vivid detail. I mean, this is even more vivid, really, than Betsy Doyle. But we don't know his name. He's called the Deserter. And the one thing that he did not do, really, was desert. What happened was he was an ordinary soldier. And he was heart-hungry to see his wife and children. And they lived 30 or 40 miles away from the cantonment. And he wanted to make sure they were okay. His main crime was being so much in love with them that he wanted to make sure they were all right. He was homesick. And so 3 times he took his horse and he galloped along 30 or 40 miles to the farm, saw that his family was safe, and came back. He always planned to come back. However, the 3rd time he did it, he was caught. And immediately he was made an example of. He was a deserter. They court-martialed him, and they sentenced him to die by firing squad. He was to be executed. And there was no reprieve or pardon. There was nothing available to him. He was going to die. Now, we know about his story, although we don't know his name, because there was a doctor at the cantonment, an officer. And he did not want to have anything to do with killing a fellow comrade, but he was there, and his commanding officer said, you must witness the execution and make sure that he's dead. Make sure it was carried out properly. He didn't want anything to do with it, but he felt such compassion for this man, because he understood what he had done, that he went to see him the next day after his court-martial. And the man was sitting there in the guardhouse, and his leg, he had a chain around his leg, and it was attached to a beam in the guardhouse. And he was reading a Bible. He was very, very afraid, but he was trying not to show it. And he knew there would be no time for a reprieve or a pardon. He knew that he had to accept his fate, and he was trying very hard to. He asked for a minister of the Bible to be brought to him, and he asked to see his family one more time. Well, the doctor knows for sure that he did have a minister of the Bible come to him, but no one ever knew if he was allowed to see his wife and children again. Oh, the soldier was beside himself with fear, and he was taken out on the morning of the execution. He had his hands tied behind his back. He had a minister on one side of him and a minister on the other. And he was walking. They had to walk in a procession along the whole of that cantonment grounds until they got to a big open field. Now, in front of this condemned man, there was a plain wooden box carried on the shoulders of a soldier, 2 soldiers, just a plain wooden box. That was right in front of him at all times. And then behind him were other prisoners who hadn't been condemned to death, but had been condemned for various infractions and punishments. And they were marching in the procession, and next to them were soldiers with fixed bayonets and rifles so that these men would stay in line. And then behind that, There was a drummer drumming and fifes playing a mournful death march. I think it was, in my own mind, I think it's da 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 da, which was very, very solemn. In fact, the doctor was so impressed. Even the officers, as they ordered the procession to move forward, were quiet with their orders. It was very solemn, as befits a young man. He was a young man who loved his family and had a family and was going to his own death, and he had to sew his way. He's wearing a long white robe, like a winding sheet, they said. He had to sew it himself. And on where the pocket would be, or where the heart really is, he had to sew a black cloth heart right onto that spot, because that's where the executioners were going to aim at him. So he wore that, and he had a white cap on his head that could be pulled down over his eyes when the time came. And with that, they marched out of the guardhouse and away up to a big field where a hole was freshly dug. Now, there waiting for them was all the people in the cantonment. It seemed that every soldier had been marched out to witness this execution. The doctor described it as being a great big square with one side open, and at that side, that's where the grave was. And they were all waiting silently for the procession to finally get to that big open field. And the coffin was put down parallel to the grave, about 2 feet distant, and the man was ordered, the condemned man was ordered to stand in the middle of that area. He was as white as the winding sheet he was wearing. He was trembling, but the doctor said he was trying his hardest to die like a soldier. And so he stood there, and he asked if he could please say a word. Now, in the meantime, while that was happening, the executioners had to be chosen earlier. Nobody wanted to volunteer for such a duty to kill a comrade. So no one ever volunteered for this duty, but lots were drawn. And they had 8 men, 8 soldiers that would point guns at this fellow, right at that black heart. But what the officers do is they only put ball and powder in 7 of the guns. And the 8th has powder only, so it's like a blank. It won't shoot. And so 7 of the men will actually kill the comrade, but 1 will not. And what they do is they put the guns into the middle of a pile, and each man takes a gun at random. So no one knows which one doesn't have the ball. No one knows which one just has the powder. And so they can all believe that they were the ones who did not kill the comrade. And this was traditional, and this went on every time, because no one wanted to do this duty. So the men had stepped back. The executioners were just in with the regular soldiers, waiting for their cue. And as I said, this condemned man, he was trying to speak, and they said, yes, you may speak. And he said to everybody, remember, desertion is bad. Don't ever desert. Stay and help fight and be proud of your duty. And he talked on and on and on, and his voice was getting more and more tense and higher as he was like rambling or ranting. But the officer of the day pulled out a watch, and he looked at it, and he said in a low voice, your last hour has come. It is 2 o'clock. You must kneel on your coffin. Well, the fellow could hardly move or walk, so he was helped, and he knelt on his coffin. In the meantime, he's still talking. And the sergeant took that cloth cap, and he pulled it down over the man's face and covered almost his whole face. And he's still talking and talking and talking. He's kneeling there with his hands tied behind his back. But when he knelt, that was a signal for the executioners to come out and to raise up their rifles. He couldn't see because he had that blindfold on. And all of a sudden, the commanding officer raised his arm. Now, the drums had still been beating, the rat-tat-tat of the drums. And all of a sudden, when he raised his arm, the drums stopped. There was a pause, And he jerked his arm down, and 7 balls ripped into the prisoner. 7 guns fired at him to kill him, and the 8th did not. And the prisoner himself, he screamed when the guns were fired. You could hear his scream, and then, of course, nothing. But he was raised up, and he fell in between the coffin and the grave. And he fell face first. Now, what they always did in a situation like this is that one of the sergeants had a gun, a musket, and he held the musket close to the fellow's head and fired, just to make sure that he wasn't just wounded, that he was dead. It was a moment of compassion, but as the doctor said, oh, compassion, how horrible in war, that they would have to shoot him so close, in fact, that when the ball hit, the cap burst into flames, the cap on his head. So he was lying face down with his flames on his head, and all you could smell is cotton and hair burning. And this poor man lying with finally the smoldering and smoking of that cap. And now all the men, whether it was 4,000 or how many thousand happened to be there at the time, had to walk past the grave, walk past the coffin, and walk past this so-called deserter lying there, so they would know what they would have to expect if they deserted. And then the doctor describes a funny thing, not funny, but kind of odd to us anyway, that on the way back, the drummer and the fife players who had been playing the Death March, as they walked along, now they were playing Yankee Doodle Dandy, which he called the national air. And he said it was such a lively version of Yankee Doodle, it was almost grotesque as they all marched back to the parade ground. But Yankee Doodle it was. As you know, the Star-Spangled Banner had not yet really been written, but was coming later. And they broke up, and the officers all went to the officers, the commanding officers' rooms and had drinks. But the doctor, he didn't go. He just felt that it had been such a terrible loss of life, and he had been called forth to feel for the pulse. And he said, well, there was pulse and warm blood beating. Now there was none at all. And he had said, he is dead. So he didn't want anything to do with the celebration afterwards or the getting back to normal life. He felt it was futile and as unnecessary as the war itself. And that's the story about the doctor and the deserter.